Hello and welcome back to game number 13 of Masters of the Chessboard, where we are going through the famous Richard Reti's book Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in the book one at a time and Reti's analysis of these games. This is game number 13 and we're still looking at the games of Wilhelm Steinitz, the first world champion. Steinitz in this game has the white pieces, and his opponent is George MacDonnell. And in the book talks about this game and saying it's an example of how to play more restricted positions. Steinitz preferred games where the centre was very closed, and he created a lot of the ideas about how to play in these closed positions before they were made popular by Tarrasch. And we will see some Tarrasch games later on in the book. To show you what I mean, let's play the game. So Steinitz with the white pieces plays e4, we have e5, knight f3 and d6 going into the Philidor defence. Now this Philidor defence was discussed in the Anderson-Paulsen game in game number 3 in this playlist, so I'd suggest checking that out if you want to. Now in that game we saw d4, but in this game we see bishop to c4. Now I think d4 is probably the better option, however bishop c4 is still the most common move in this position. And here Reti comments that Steinitz isn't trying to open the centre with something like d4. He's trying to get a secure defensive position in the centre so he can undertake an attack on the wings without having to worry about any potential counter-attack in the centre. Now Reti does note, however, that developing the light square bishop here is advantageous because Steinitz intends to put his pawn on d3, so this bishop will be outside of the pawn chain, whereas Black's bishop will be blocked in by the pawn chain. And Reti comments that this is probably quite an important point to note, that principles like this, in terms of it's often better to try and accumulate smaller advantages in the game, because it can be rare to get bigger advantages. But to get bigger advantages, you're relying on your opponent making a very big blunder. So you're more likely to be able to get smaller advantages and accumulate smaller advantages. And that's probably the better way to try and play chess, just trying to accumulate constant small advantages. And this bishop being more active because it's outside of the pawn chain is one such advantage. And MacDonnell replies with bishop to e7. We see c3, and this move c3 isn't to push d4. It's because Steinitz preferred the formation of pawns on c3, d3 and e4. It meant that any attacks on e4 he could just take back with a d-pawn, and he would still have a pawn on e4 and c3 in that instance. So he would still have the centre under control. And as long as the centre is under control, he's able to attack on the wings. And that's how Steinitz preferred to play. And we'll see this pawn formation over and over again, with the pawns on c3, d3 and e4. It's a very common theme with Steinitz. Knight f6, d3, making that pawn formation. Castles, castles, bishop to g4, h3, putting the question to the bishop. Now bishop takes f3. Now Reti comments that moves like this are inaccuracies and probably wouldn't have been played today. And the reason for this is that Black's giving away the bishop pair. He's relinquishing this pin on the knight and giving away the bishop pair for no real compensation here. And Reti comments that it probably wouldn't be seen today because it was actually Steinitz who was the first person to really demonstrate the power of a bishop pair. And so, if you're going to give up the bishop pair, you have to have a good reason for it. And MacDonnell plays c6, Steinitz plays bishop to b3, and we'll discuss this move a bit later on. Now we have knight b to d7, queen to e2, and knight to c5. And now we see the purpose of bishop to b3. because Steinitz doesn't want to trade this bishop. he wants to keep his bishop pair. So if he didn't play bishop to b3 earlier, so here he played bishop to b3. If he didn't, if he continued developing as you might expect him to, rook to e1, something like knight to c5, and then let's just give white the move. Black could respond with d5, forcing the bishop back to b3, which would then allow it to be taken. And this is what Steinitz wanted to avoid. He wanted to try and keep this bishop pair. And in this position, black has equalised. Although, granted, we did give black a free move. So because of that, he played bishop to b3 here. So now, after knight b to d7, we need 2, knight c5, he's able to retreat his bishop to c2, defending this pawn. And now, Steinitz is ready to start pushing his pawns. He's castled, the centre's under control. Both bishops are actually fairly active. This knight needs to come into the game, and the bishop's still on the back rank. But this bishop is as good as it's going to get. This is a diagonal which he wants to control. So Steinitz is ready to try and start pushing f4 and start trying to create a counter-attack on the king. MacDonnell plays knight to e6, and now Steinitz plays g3, postponing f4, preparing it in some ways with g3, because he wants to keep his two bishops. If he played f4 straight away, we could see e takes f4, and after bishop takes f4, knight takes f4, rook takes f4, and Steinitz has given away his bishop pair. He's given away his good bishop, the powerful bishop that was eyeing up the king's side, and actually what has he got here? His king's a bit exposed, his knight is undeveloped, his rook is undeveloped, and his bishop is just aiming at pawns needlessly, and his rook's just floating in the air here. Steinitz's position is pretty poor here. The computer valuation gives it at -1.2 for black. So, yeah, and this is a position which he wanted to avoid. So he doesn't go for f4 straight away. Because this knight has moved to e6, he doesn't go for f4. He plays g3 first, intending f4 next move. Queen c7, f4, rook f to e8. Now we have knight d2, rook a to d8, bringing both rooks into the game, centralising them. Knight to f3, and now we have king h8. And black's quite stuck. Reti comments that black just doesn't really know what to do next. The centre is fairly equal, it's closed, there's no real ways to properly break through in the centre, and black's developed all of his pieces to probably the most active squares he can. So what's he going to do next? He's a bit stuck. But Steinitz, however, has a clear game plan. He's able to push f5, attacking the knight and opening up this bishop. And now white's advantage is quite clear. We see knight f8, g4, pushing these pawns forward, attacking the king. It's quite clear who's got the initiative in this position. We've got h6, g5, h takes g5, knight takes g5, and king g8, moving off this semi-open file. But moving on to this semi-open file. Here we see king h1, and now white's advantage, according to Reti, can be quite easily seen, because it's quite clear that you can imagine a very strong attack by doubling up or even tripling up on this open g file, with both rooks and the queen all on this g file attacking this g7 pawn. Black's going to struggle to defend it. And this tripling up can be achieved quite easily because white has the space to do so. You can imagine quite a number of ways in which white can possibly triple up on the g file. He just needs to move the bishop out, he can move the rook, go that way, he can go this way, he can bring his queen to there, he can bring his queen to there and move it up. There's a whole load of options open to white for tripling up on his g file. And this bishop is also able to develop to h6 to pressure the g7 pawn even more. And that's because white has got the initiative and white has got the space advantage. Meanwhile, black, well, how is black going to defend this pawn? He manages to put up a bit of a defence, but his pieces are all on each other's toes. He's got no space, his pieces aren't that coordinated, and they're not able to really defend this pawn at all. And it's obviously quite a crucial pawn, being the centre of the king's defence. And we see how black manages to sort of get some coordination going, but it's just not enough. Plays knight to h7, offering a trade of knights. And Reti declines, playing knight to f3. Sorry, Steinitz declines, playing knight to f3. And Reti comments on this move, saying that when you're attacking someone with less space, you want to try and avoid exchanging pieces unless it is necessary, since if a black player was able to get a few pieces exchanged, they would have a bit more freedom and a bit more space to move the remaining pieces around it. Whereas now, the pieces are still all stepping on each other's toes, and it's difficult for black to still coordinate his pieces. We see rook to d7, preparing the defence of the 7th rank and the g7 pawn. Rook to g1, bishop to d8, now bishop to h6, attacking the g7 pawn and developing. Note the pawn is pinned, so it can't take the bishop. And we see f6. This is why the bishop never went to f6, it retreated back to here, because by playing f6, black is able to get all his heavy pieces on the 7th rank, so they're all defending this g7 pawn. Quite a nice way to defend, actually, although it's not quite enough. You see rook g2, d5, and here Reti comments that black quite naturally wants to try and get more freedom. He's responding to an attack on the wing with a counter-attack in the centre, hoping to try and get more space and more freedom in the most dynamic way possible. However, this unfortunately leads to Steinitz being able to control his position even more. At first, Steinitz doubles up in the g file. Rook e7, and now e takes d5. C takes d5, bishop to a4, eyeing down here. And we see how Steinitz waited for this rook to move to e7 before playing his bishop, because actually this rook's got even less good squares. It's only actually got one square. And we also see how black exchanged off his light square bishop earlier on in the game for the knight. Whereas if he had the light square bishop now, he may well have been able to use it to counteract white's light square bishop. But he didn't, he traded it off. So white has now got this light square bishop with no counterpart, eyeing straight down black's position. Now in the game, black played rook d6. However, to put in perspective just how bad black's position is, just because of how limited his options are, and how powerful white's attack is, the computer actually says to just give up the exchange. The computer says the best continuation for black is knight g5, after which bishop takes d5, f takes g5, bishop takes d7, rook takes d7, knight takes e5, attacking the rook again, and after rook d6, rook d4. And this is the best continuation the computer could find for black. They've given up an exchange and a pawn. They have white has this amazing knight. The rooks are doubled on a g-file against a fairly defenceless king, and this pawn is about to fall. And this is the best that the computer could find for black. And that was in this position. So it's fairly clear that black's position is fairly hopeless just by going off what the computer says. Now MacDonnell doesn't give up the exchange. He plays rook to d6 instead. And now we see rook takes g7. The defender has been removed of this pawn, so Steinitz goes in for the attack. Rook takes g7. Rook takes g7, attacking the king and the queen. Queen takes g7. And bishop takes g7. and this is where the game stops. Now, I think the game did have a few more moves actually played, but in the book, this is where the analysis ends. And it's fairly clear why. After taking here, White's position is just easily won. Black's knights are out of the game. This bishop still has to come into the game. White's bishop is quite active now, eyeing down into the black camp. This knight is also fairly active, and White has a queen for a rook and a mana piece and a pawn. So, yeah, this position is quite easily won for White, and I think that's why there was no further analysis in the book. And I'm not going to try and analyse the end game myself. I'll leave it to yourselves if you want to have a look at it to analyse it. I don't want to do it as a disservice or offer any misinformation. But that's the game, and yeah, I think as Reti said in the start, it's quite an instructive idea about how Steinitz played these positions, how he got this closed centre, and he made a counter-attack against the king, against the enemy king. And also about the bishop pair, about how he was able to use the bishop pair to his advantage, how this bishop was able to attack a weak point, this bishop was able to attack into his opponent's camps, whereas Black didn't really have any effective way to counter that. So that's game number 13. And we've still got a few more games of Steinitz. So if you like this, please like, comment and subscribe. I would very much appreciate it. If you've got any feedback, please drop a comment below and I'll definitely read it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the future games.